Hey everyone! Before we jump into this story, I need you to do something really important. If you're struggling with housing right now, if you're watching rent eat up your entire paycheck, if you're facing eviction, or you just can't find anywhere affordable to live, hit that subscribe button right now. We cover housing issues every single week, breaking down the policies that are crushing working families, and giving you real, actionable information you can use. This isn't just about documenting problems. It's about fighting back and demanding change. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's do this together. All right, let's talk about what's happening in Florida right now, because something huge is shifting. For years, Governor DeSantis has been able to push his agenda without much organized resistance from ordinary Floridians. Sure, there have been protests here and there, but nothing that really threatened his power or forced him to change course. But the housing crisis has changed everything. Florida families are finally fighting back, and DeSantis is facing the kind of grassroots opposition that actually scares politicians. This isn't just angry social media posts anymore. This is real organizing, real political pressure, and it's starting to have real consequences. Let's start with how we got here, because understanding the failure is crucial to understanding why people are so angry. DeSantis came into office promising to make Florida the freest state in America. He talked about economic opportunity, about people fleeing high-tax states to come to Florida for a better life. He built his entire brand around this idea that Florida was doing everything right while places like California and New York were doing everything wrong. And for a while, a lot of people believed him. The population was growing. The economy looked good on paper. Property values were going up. If you already owned property or if you were wealthy, Florida seemed great. But if you were a working family, if you were a teacher or a nurse or a construction worker or a service industry employee, the reality was completely different. Rents started skyrocketing. Home prices became totally disconnected from what ordinary people earn. Landlords started raising rents by hundreds or even thousands of dollars with little notice. Evictions increased dramatically. Insurance costs went through the roof. And through all of this, DeSantis and the Republican legislature were actively making things worse by gutting tenant protections, blocking rent control, making evictions easier, and doing absolutely nothing to rein in corporate landlords or address the insurance crisis. For a long time, people suffered in silence. They struggled. They made impossible choices between rent and food or medicine. They moved further and further from their jobs. They doubled up with family in overcrowded apartments. They lived in their cars, but they didn't organize. They didn't fight back in a coordinated way. Part of that was just survival mode. When you're working 2 or 3 jobs just to keep a roof over your head, you don't have time or energy for activism. Part of it was feeling isolated and powerless. When you're struggling, it's easy to think it's just you, that everyone else is doing fine, that maybe you're the problem. But something changed over the past year or so. People started talking to each other. They started realizing that everyone was struggling with the same issues. Teachers started sharing stories about not being able to afford to live near their schools. Nurses started talking about sleeping in their cars between shifts. Service workers started organizing around the fact that they literally couldn't afford to live in the communities where they worked. And crucially, they started connecting their individual struggles to the policy choices that DeSantis and the legislature had made. The tenant organizing that's happening across Florida right now is really remarkable. Tenant unions are forming in cities all across the state. These are groups of renters coming together to collectively negotiate with landlords to fight unfair evictions, to push for policy changes that actually protect tenants. In Miami, there are tenant unions organizing rent strikes against corporate landlords who impose massive rent increases. In Orlando, tenants are showing up to city council meetings demanding stronger renter protections despite state preemption laws. In Tampa, tenant organizers are running workshops teaching people their rights and how to fight back against predatory landlords. This is exactly the kind of organizing that politicians like DeSantis fear, because it's not just complaining. It's not just voting and hoping things get better. It's people building collective power and using that power to directly challenge the systems that are oppressing them. When 100 tenants in an apartment complex refuse to pay rent until conditions improve and rents are lowered, that gets the landlord's attention. When hundreds of people pack a city council meeting demanding action on housing, that gets politicians' attention. When tenant unions start endorsing candidates and mobilizing voters around housing issues, that changes elections. We're also seeing organized resistance from workers and unions. The teachers' union in Florida has made housing affordability a central issue in their contract negotiations and political advocacy. They're pointing out correctly that you cannot staff schools if teachers can't afford to live anywhere near those schools. The nurses' unions are doing the same thing, arguing that the healthcare system cannot function if healthcare workers are being priced out of the communities they serve. Service worker unions are connecting housing costs to wage demands, saying we need $15 an hour or $20 an hour because rent is $3,000 a month. This worker organizing is powerful because it connects workplace issues to community issues. It's not just about what happens on the job. It's about whether workers can afford to live with dignity. And it puts pressure on employers as well as politicians. Hospitals that are having trouble staffing shifts because nurses can't afford housing have to either pay more or push for housing solutions. School districts that can't fill teaching positions have to address the affordability crisis. Businesses that can't find workers because nobody can afford to live nearby have to get involved in pushing for change. There's also been an explosion of housing advocacy organizations and mutual aid networks, groups that provide direct assistance to people facing eviction, that help people navigate the broken system, that provide emergency housing funds, that organize legal support. But crucially, these groups aren't just providing charity. They're also organizing politically. They're turning the people they help into activists. They're building power. Every person who gets help avoiding an eviction is a potential member, a potential volunteer, a potential voter who understands exactly what's at stake. Young people are particularly active in this fight, and that makes sense because they're the ones being most comprehensively locked out of homeownership and stable housing. There are youth-led organizations across Florida focused specifically on housing justice. They're using social media incredibly effectively to spread information, to organize actions, to call out politicians who are failing on housing. They're showing up to protests, to city council meetings, to candidate forums, and they're voting. Young voter turnout has been increasing, and housing is consistently one of their top issues. What's really interesting is that this organizing is crossing traditional political lines. Yes, progressive activists are heavily involved, but you're also seeing conservative homeowners getting involved because they're furious about insurance costs and property taxes. You're seeing small landlords organizing because they're being squeezed by the same forces affecting tenants. You're seeing veterans groups advocating for housing because so many veterans are struggling. You're seeing religious congregations getting involved because housing is a moral issue and they're seeing their own members suffer. This broad coalition is politically powerful because it can't be easily dismissed or pigeonholed. When a protest against housing unaffordability includes progressive young people and conservative retirees and veterans and teachers and nurses and religious leaders, politicians can't just write it off as radical leftists or whatever their usual dismissal would be. It represents a genuine cross-section of Florida, and that's dangerous for someone like DeSantis, whose response to everything is to pick cultural fights and divide people. The fight back is also happening at the ballot box in ways that are making politicians nervous. There have been several local elections in Florida recently where housing was a dominant issue and where candidates who ran on strong housing platforms won, sometimes in upsets. City councils are changing. County commissions are changing. Even some state legislative seats have flipped based largely on housing issues. Voters are paying attention to who's fighting for affordable housing and who's protecting corporate landlords, and they're making decisions accordingly. There are also ballot initiative efforts underway in several Florida cities to implement tenant protections, rent stabilization, and affordable housing requirements despite state preemption. Some of these will probably get challenged in court, but the organizing process itself is valuable. It educates people, builds networks, and sends a message to politicians that people are demanding change and willing to fight for it. The media attention around Florida's housing crisis has intensified dramatically, and that's partly because of the organizing. When tenant unions hold press conferences, that gets coverage. When hundreds of people march on the state capitol demanding housing justice, that gets coverage. When teachers talk about living in their cars, that's a compelling story that journalists want to tell. And all of this coverage makes it harder for DeSantis to ignore or downplay the crisis. Social media has been crucial in this fight. People are sharing their stories, their eviction notices, their rent increase letters, their struggles to find affordable housing. These personal stories humanize the crisis in a way that statistics can't. When you see a video of a veteran crying because he's being evicted after 30 years in the same apartment, that hits different than hearing about eviction rates. When you see a teacher explaining how she's commuting 3 hours each way because she can't afford to live near her school, that crystallizes the problem. Hashtags like Florida housing crisis and DeSantis failed us have been trending regularly. People are organizing digital campaigns targeting DeSantis' social media, flooding his posts with comments about housing. They're organizing email and phone campaigns to legislators. They're using online platforms to coordinate in-person actions. The digital organizing is complementing and amplifying the on-the-ground work. One of the most powerful aspects of the fight back is how it's exposing the contradictions in DeSantis' rhetoric. He talks constantly about freedom. But what freedom do you have if you can't afford a place to live? He talks about Florida being a land of opportunity. But what opportunities exist if you're working 3 jobs and still can't make rent? He talks about protecting families. But his policies have devastated working families. Activists and organizers are taking his own language and throwing it back at him, and is effective because it highlights the gap between his rhetoric and reality. We're also seeing more direct action tactics. Rent strikes, as I mentioned. Eviction blockades, where community members physically show up to prevent sheriffs from carrying out evictions. Building occupations, where homeless people and housing activists take over vacant buildings owned by investors or banks. These tactics are more confrontational, and they don't always succeed, but they raise the stakes and they get attention. Legal advocacy has also ramped up significantly. There are now several legal aid organizations in Florida focused specifically on housing issues, providing free or low-cost legal representation to tenants facing eviction. People dealing with housing discrimination, homeowners fighting with insurance companies. They're also filing lawsuits challenging some of the state laws that preempt local tenant protections, arguing that these laws are unconstitutional. Even if they don't win every case, the litigation creates pressure and costs for the state and for corporate landlords. What's really encouraging is seeing how this organizing is developing leaders from within affected communities. People who never thought of themselves as activists are stepping up because they have to. The tenant who successfully fought her eviction becomes a person helping other tenants. The teacher who spoke at a school board meeting about housing becomes the one organizing other teachers. The nurse who shared her story on social media becomes a spokesperson for healthcare workers. This grassroots leadership development is sustainable in a way that top-down organizing isn't. DeSantis' response to all of this has been telling. Mostly, he's ignored it. He doesn't want to acknowledge that there's a housing crisis because that undermines his narrative about Florida being successful. When he is forced to address it, he deflects. He blames federal policy. He blames people moving to Florida. He blames anything except his own policy choices. But the deflection is becoming less effective because the organizing has made it very clear how state policy created and worsened this crisis. There have been some small concessions. A few Republican legislators have proposed modest reforms, like slightly increasing funding for affordable housing programs or tweaking eviction procedures. These are nowhere near adequate to the scale of the problem, but the fact that they're happening at all shows that the political pressure is working. Politicians don't propose changes unless they feel they have to, and they're starting to feel like they have to do something about housing. But here's the critical thing. The fight back isn't just about getting DeSantis or other politicians to make small changes. It's about building lasting power for working people. The tenant unions that are forming now will still exist after DeSantis is gone. The networks being built will persist. The people who are learning to organize and fight for their rights will carry those skills forward. This is about changing the fundamental balance of power in Florida, making it so that working families have a voice and landlords and developers can't just do whatever they want. The challenges are real. Florida's political system is rigged in favor of wealthy interests. Corporate landlords have massive resources. The state government is hostile to tenant organizing and worker organizing. There's active repression in some places, with police being used to break up tenant actions or eviction blockades. The legal system is tilted toward property owners. The barriers are significant, but what gives me hope is seeing ordinary people refuse to give up. The single mother who shows up to every city council meeting to demand affordable housing even though she's exhausted from working 2 jobs. The young organizer who's building a tenant union in her apartment complex even though she's risking eviction herself for organizing. The teacher who keeps speaking out about housing even though her principal told her to be quiet. The veteran who's organizing other veterans to push for housing support even though he's living in his car. These are heroes. These are the people changing Florida. The fight back is also starting to impact DeSantis' national image and ambitions. He wanted to be president. He ran on the Florida model. But the housing crisis and the resistance to it have become part of the national conversation about him. Journalists covering DeSantis nationally are asking him about housing. Voters in other states are hearing about what's happening in Florida. It's become a liability for him, and that matters politically. Looking forward, the question is whether this organizing can sustain itself and grow. Can tenant unions continue to build membership and power? Can the coalition of affected people hold together across their differences? Can the movement translate grassroots energy into actual policy change and political victories? Can it survive the inevitable backlash and repression? These are open questions, but the fact that they're even being asked is significant.